big mistake. She slapped the billionaire's black wife in public. 5 minutes later, she and her entire family were begging for mercy and forgiveness. "You don't belong here," Charlotte Reed's voice cut through the champagne-soaked air of the Manhattan Plaza ballroom. Every conversation stopped. Heads swiveled toward the confrontation like spectators at a gladiator match. A woman in a white designer gown towered over the table where Deja Styles sat in a deep crimson dress, pearls at her throat. Charlotte's perfectly manicured hand rose in the air, trembling with rage. "Did you really think you could walk into our world wearing that? Crack!" The slap echoed beneath the golden chandeliers like thunder before a storm. 500 guests froze. Phones lifted. Whispers ignited. "Who is she?" someone murmured. "Probably crashed the event," another voice answered with a nervous laugh. But Deja Styles didn't flinch. Her dark eyes remained steady, her posture unchanged. She had faced worse than this. What Charlotte Reed didn't know, what she was about to discover in the most devastating way possible, was that she had just sealed her fate. In less than 5 minutes, she and her entire family would be on their knees, begging for mercy. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The early evening light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Styles penthouse overlooking Central Park on March 12, 2025, casting a warm glow across the master bedroom. Deja Styles stood before her walk-in closet, her fingers grazing the fabric of a deep crimson gown that hung among hundreds of designer pieces. At 32, Deja possessed a quiet elegance that required no announcement. Rich brown skin that seemed to catch light from within, expressive dark eyes that held both strength and vulnerability, and a gentle grace that had captured Alexander Styles's heart 3 years ago. She wasn't just beautiful, she was present, grounded, real. "This one," she whispered to herself, lifting the crimson dress from its hanger. The fabric was luxurious silk, perfectly tailored but understated. No excessive embellishments, no desperate bids for attention. It was the kind of dress that let the woman wearing it be the statement. Exactly how Deja preferred to move through the world. From the adjoining bathroom came the sound of running water as Alexander finished his shower. At 40, Alexander Styles commanded any room he entered. 6'3", of quiet authority with steel-gray eyes that had built a tech empire worth $8 billion. His company, Styles Technologies, had revolutionized global data security. But right now, his focus was entirely on the evening ahead with his wife. "Deja, love, are you almost ready?" Alexander's voice carried from the bathroom, warm with the slight southern accent that emerged when he was relaxed. "The gala starts at 7. Deja glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 5:45 p.m. She slipped into the crimson gown, appreciating how the fabric draped naturally against her curves. As she fastened the single strand of pearls Alexander had given her on their wedding day, simple, timeless, meaningful, she caught her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at her seemed suspended between two realities. The girl who had grown up in a cramped Atlanta apartment, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses, and the wife of one of America's most powerful men. Some days, she still wasn't sure which version of herself was real or if both could exist in the same body. Alexander emerged from the bathroom, adjusting his tailored black tuxedo. He looked every inch the billionaire, from his perfectly styled salt and pepper hair to his custom Italian shoes. But when he saw Deja, his expression shifted. Love mixed with something else. Concern, maybe. Protectiveness. "You're stunning," he said, crossing to where she stood. His hands found her waist, pulling her close. You always are. Deja heard the unspoken but in his tone. They'd had this conversation before, gently, lovingly, but it never fully went away. It hovered between them like humidity before rain. I know what you're thinking, she said softly, smoothing the lapels of his jacket, even though they didn't need adjusting. You wish I'd wear the Versace. Alexander's thumb traced the curve of her cheek. I want you to wear whatever makes you feel like yourself. It's just… He paused, choosing his words with care. These galas attract a certain kind of crowd. People who judge before they understand. I don't want anyone to make you feel less than who you are, because they're too shallow to see it. Deja's chest tightened. This was the eternal dance of their marriage. Alexander's fierce protectiveness colliding with her stubborn need to remain authentic. She understood his concern. In their world of $100,000 tables and social posturing, appearance often meant more than substance, but transforming herself into someone unrecognizable felt like betraying the woman he'd fallen in love with. I can change, she said quietly, turning back toward the closet. But Alexander caught her hand before she could move. No. His voice was firm, but tender. I fell in love with the woman who wore a sundress to our first date and made it look like royalty. Don't change for anyone. Not even for me. The memory warmed them both. That spring afternoon 3 years ago when they'd met at a community center in Harlem seemed like another lifetime. Deja had been working as a youth mentor, pouring her heart into kids the world had written off, barely making rent, but rich in purpose. Alexander, taking a rare break from his relentless schedule to volunteer, had been immediately captivated by her passionate speech about education and opportunity. Are you sure? Deja asked, searching his face for doubt. I'm sure. Alexander kissed her forehead. You're perfect, exactly as you are. Let them see the woman I see. Deja nodded, but as they prepared to leave for the gala, a quiet unease settled in her stomach. She'd been to these events before. She'd felt the stares, heard the whispers, endured the thinly veiled condescension, but tonight felt different somehow. Heavier. As their driver pulled up to the Manhattan Plaza, the glittering ballroom visible through towering glass doors, Deja took a deep breath. She had no idea that in less than 2 hours, her life would change forever. The Manhattan Plaza ballroom was a cathedral of wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings like frozen starbursts, each one worth more than most people earned in a year. The floors were polished marble, so pristine they reflected the glittering crowd like a mirror. Tall arched windows overlooked the glowing city skyline, and silk drapes in ivory and gold framed each one like works of art. Tables draped in cream linen filled the space, each adorned with towering centerpieces of white orchids and roses. Champagne flutes caught the light, sparkling like liquid diamonds. A string quartet played softly in one corner, their elegant music barely audible over the hum of conversation, deals being made, alliances being formed, reputations being built or destroyed with a single whispered word. This was the annual Metropolitan Charity Gala, one of New York's most exclusive events. Tickets started at $50,000 per seat. The guest list read like a Forbes cover story. Tech moguls, real estate titans, entertainment royalty, old money families whose fortunes stretched back generations, and Deja Styles, walking through the entrance on Alexander's arm, felt every single eye turn toward her. Mr. Styles, welcome! A silver-haired event coordinator rushed forward, clipboard in hand, her smile bright and practiced. "Your table is ready, of course. Table 1, right up front." "Thank you, Margaret," Alexander said warmly, guiding Deja forward with a protective hand on the small of her back. As they moved through the crowd, Deja felt the weight of scrutiny like a physical thing. It wasn't hostile exactly, more curious, assessing. She could practically hear the thoughts. Who is she? I don't recognize her. That dress is nice, but it's not Dior. Is she new money? No money? His +1? Deja had learned to read these rooms, the slight pause before someone smiled. The way eyes traveled from her face to her jewelry to her shoes, tallying up her worth like an equation. The polite questions that were really interrogations. And what do you do? Where are you from? How did you two meet? She'd been through this dance dozens of times since marrying Alexander, and every time she had to prove herself worthy of standing beside him. "Alexander, there you are!" A broad-shouldered man in his 50s approached, hand extended, his smile genuine. Richard Chen, a venture capitalist Alexander had known for years. His wife Linda followed behind him, elegant in a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than a small car. "Richard, good to see you," Alexander said, shaking his hand firmly. "Linda, you look lovely." "Oh, stop," Linda said, waving him off with a laugh. Then her eyes landed on Deja. "And this must be your wife. Deja, isn't it? We've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," Deja said with a warm smile, extending her hand. Linda's handshake was brief, her gaze flickering over Deja's dress, with the trained eye of someone who spent her life evaluating appearances. "Of course," she said smoothly, "that color is striking on you." Deja recognized the tone. It wasn't quite a compliment. More of an observation. A polite way of saying, "I noticed you chose something different." "Thank you," Deja replied, refusing to let the comment land. "I've always loved crimson. It feels both powerful and grounded." Richard jumped in, sensing the slight tension. "Alexander, we need to catch up about the CloudSync merger. I've got some thoughts." And just like that, the conversation shifted to business. Deja stood beside Alexander, smiling politely, but she could feel Linda's gaze still assessing her, categorizing her, deciding where she fit or didn't fit in this world. After a few minutes, Alexander excused them and guided Deja toward their table at the front of the ballroom. "You okay?" he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm fine," Deja assured him, squeezing his hand. And she was, mostly. This was just part of the territory. She'd learned to let the microaggressions roll off her back like water off glass. But as they reached table 1, Deja's attention was caught by a woman standing near the bar. She was impossible to miss. Tall, blonde, and draped in a white designer gown that clung to her frame like it had been painted on. Diamonds glittered at her throat, wrists, and ears, so many that she sparkled like a human chandelier. Her hair was swept into an elaborate updo, her makeup flawless, her posture radiating confidence and entitlement in equal measure. She was surrounded by a small circle of admirers, other women in equally expensive gowns, men in tuxedos who laughed a little too loudly at her jokes. She held court like a queen, her gestures grand and theatrical, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "That's Charlotte Reed," Alexander said quietly, following Deja's gaze. His tone had shifted, careful, almost warning. "Who?" Deja asked. "Charlotte Wentworth Reed. Old money family, married into more money. Her husband's family owns half the real estate in Manhattan." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. Well, She's got a reputation. For what? For being exactly what you'd expect someone like her to be. Deja studied Charlotte from across the room. The way she touched the arm of the man beside her. Possessive, performative. The way her laugh rang out just a little too loud, demanding attention. The way her eyes scanned the room constantly, as if checking to make sure everyone was still watching her. And then, as if sensing Deja's gaze, Charlotte's eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the crowded ballroom. Charlotte's expression shifted. Confusion, then curiosity, then something colder. Her eyes traveled slowly down Deja's dress, back up to her face, and then over to Alexander. Recognition flickered. Then something else. Something sharp. Charlotte leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered something. The woman's eyes darted toward Deja. She whispered to someone else. And like a virus spreading, the looks began to multiply. "Let's sit," Alexander said, his hand tightening on Deja's waist. They took their seats at table 1, surrounded by other prominent couples, a tech CEO and his wife, a philanthropist, a Broadway producer. Introductions were made, pleasantries exchanged. But Deja couldn't shake the feeling of Charlotte's eye on her, even from across the room. 15 minutes later, Charlotte made her move. She glided across the ballroom floor like she owned it, her entourage following in her wake. She paused at several tables along the way, greeting people with exaggerated enthusiasm, air-kissing cheeks, laughing at jokes that probably weren't funny. And then she arrived at table 1. "Alexander Styles," Charlotte purred, her voice dripping with syrupy sweetness. "I was wondering when I'd see you tonight." Alexander stood politely, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Charlotte, good to see you." "Oh, please, don't lie," Charlotte said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "No one is ever happy to see me. I'm far too honest for that." She turned her attention to Deja, and her smile sharpened. "And you must be. Well, I'm afraid I don't know who you are." Charlotte's tone was light, almost playful, but her eyes were cold. "Are you new to these events? I know absolutely everyone, and I don't think we've met." Deja rose to her feet, meeting Charlotte's gaze evenly. "I'm Deja. Deja Styles." "Styles?" Charlotte's eyebrows lifted in exaggerated surprise. She glanced at Alexander, then back to Deja. Oh, you're together?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. The rest of the table had gone silent, watching the exchange with barely concealed interest. "Deja is my wife," Alexander said firmly, his voice carrying an edge now. Charlotte's hand flew to her chest in mock shock. "Your wife? Well, isn't that lovely?" She turned her full attention to Deja, her smile never wavering. "I'm so sorry, darling. I just assumed you were, well, never mind what I assumed. It's wonderful to meet you." Deja extended her hand. Charlotte took it, her grip limp and dismissive. "That's such a beautiful dress," Charlotte continued, her tone saccharine, "so simple, elegant in its own way. Very, what's the word, understated." "Thank you," Deja said evenly, refusing to take the bait. "Where did you get it? I'm always looking for more accessible designers." Charlotte tilted her head, her smile widening. "Not everyone can afford haute couture, and I think that's wonderful. Really. There's something so authentic about shopping within your means." The insult was wrapped in compliments, delivered with a smile, but everyone at the table heard it. Alexander's hand found Deja's under the table, squeezing gently. A silent message. "Don't engage." But Charlotte wasn't finished. You know, Alexander, she said, turning to him with exaggerated concern, you really should have warned me you were bringing a guest. I would have made sure you were seated somewhere more comfortable. Table 1 can be a bit intimidating for people who aren't used to this kind of attention. Deja is exactly where she belongs, Alexander said, his voice like steel. Of course she is. Charlotte's laugh was sharp and bright. I didn't mean anything by it. I just know how overwhelming these events can be for outsiders. All the cameras, the reporters, the social expectations. It's a lot to navigate if you're not from this world. Deja felt the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her expression calm. She'd dealt with women like Charlotte before, women who weaponized politeness, women who smiled while they cut you. I appreciate your concern, Deja said quietly, but I'm perfectly comfortable. Charlotte's eyes narrowed just slightly. She wasn't used to being resisted. She was used to people shrinking, apologizing, removing themselves from her presence. Well, Charlotte said, her tone cooling, if you need anything, fashion advice, etiquette tips, a list of acceptable designers, you just let me know. I'm always happy to help those who are new. And with that, she turned on her heel and glided back to her own table, her entourage following like obedient ducklings. The moment she was out of earshot, the Broadway producer across from Deja let out a low whistle. Well, that was uncomfortable. That was Charlotte, the tech CEO's wife said with a sigh. She's always like that. She can't stand not being the center of attention. Alexander's jaw was clenched. I'm sorry, Deja. I should have. Don't, Deja said softly, placing her hand over his. I'm fine, really. But she wasn't, not entirely, because as she glanced back across the ballroom, she saw Charlotte surrounded by her friends, all of them looking in her direction, whispering, laughing. And Deja realized with cold certainty that Charlotte Reed had just decided she was a problem that needed to be dealt with. The evening was about to get much worse. The dinner service began with all the ceremony of a royal coronation. White-gloved servers materialized like ghosts, placing plates of seared scallops with microgreens and edible flowers before each guest. Wine stewards moved from table to table, pouring vintages that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly rent. The string quartet transitioned into something more dramatic. Vivaldi, maybe, or Brahms, as the ballroom settled into the rhythm of the evening. Deja picked up her fork, grateful for something to do with her hands. Beside her, Alexander made easy conversation with the tech CEO about cloud infrastructure and data encryption. On her other side, the philanthropist's wife, a rail-thin woman named Victoria, with a severe black dress and sharper cheekbones, turned to her with practiced interest. So, Deja, Victoria said, her tone pleasant but probing. What do you do? Are you in tech like Alexander? Here it was, the inevitable question, the one that always came up at these events, loaded with subtext. Are you someone important, or are you just here because of who you married? I work with youth literacy programs, Deja answered, setting down her fork. I coordinate volunteer efforts in underserved communities, helping kids who've fallen through the cracks of the education system. Victoria's smile remained fixed, but something flickered in her eyes. Confusion, maybe, or disappointment. Oh, she said after a beat. How noble. The word hung there like a wet towel. Noble. Translation, sweet, but not serious. Charity work, not real work. It's important work, Deja said evenly. Education is the foundation of everything. Economic mobility, social justice, community building. If we don't invest in our children, we're failing as a society. Absolutely, Victoria agreed, though her attention was already drifting. We donate to several education foundations. It's such a worthy cause. And just like that, the conversation was over. Victoria turned to the person on her other side, and Deja was left alone with her scallops. She glanced around the table. Everyone was engaged in animated discussions, mergers and acquisitions, real estate developments, upcoming political campaigns. The kind of talk that moved millions of dollars with a handshake. The kind of power that reshaped cities. Deja had nothing to contribute to these conversations. She knew literacy rates in the Bronx, not stock portfolios. She knew which communities needed more libraries, not which neighborhoods were ripe for gentrification. "You don't belong here," a small voice whispered in the back of her mind. She pushed the thought away, focusing on her food. But the feeling lingered, stubborn as a bruise. Across the ballroom, Charlotte Reed was holding court. Her table, Table 7, strategically positioned where everyone could see her, had become the center of attention. Laughter erupted from the group every few minutes, loud enough to turn heads. Charlotte's voice carried above the others, sharp and musical, commanding the space like a conductor leading an orchestra. She was in her element. This was her stage. Charlotte Wentworth Reed had been born into the kind of wealth most people couldn't fathom. Her family tree included railroad magnates, oil barons, and a senator who'd helped shape the nation's financial policies in the 1950s. She'd attended the best boarding schools, summered in the Hamptons, made her debut at the Waldorf Astoria when she was 18, and then she'd married Marcus Reed, heir to the Reed real estate empire, a family that owned half of Manhattan's most valuable properties. Charlotte had everything: wealth, status, beauty, access. But what she craved more than anything was adoration. She needed to be the most beautiful woman in the room, the most interesting, the most important. She measured her worth not by what she possessed, but by how many people turned to look at her when she walked by how many whispers followed in her wake, by how many times her name appeared in society columns and Instagram posts, and she had constructed her entire identity around maintaining that position. Which is why Deja Styles, sitting at table 1 in a simple crimson gown, drawing no attention to herself, seemingly unbothered by the spectacle around her, represented a threat. Not because Deja was trying to compete. That was what made it worse. Deja wasn't playing the game, and somehow that made her more interesting than Charlotte could stand. "Did you see that dress?" Charlotte's voice carried across the ballroom, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. She was speaking to her friend Margot, a bottle blonde in emerald green, but her words were clearly meant for a wider audience. "Which dress?" Margot asked, taking the bait. "The red one, at table 1. Charlotte gestured with her champagne flute, not bothering to be subtle. "I mean, it's fine if you're going to a business lunch, but for the Metropolitan Gala? Darling, there's a dress code." The women at her table leaned in, eager for gossip. "Who is she?" asked Priya, a tech heiress with flawless skin and a diamond choker. "Apparently," Charlotte said, drawing out the word with dramatic emphasis, "she's Alexander Styles' wife." "Wait, Alexander's married?" Margot's eyes widened. "Since when?" 3 years, I'm told." Charlotte took a slow sip of champagne, letting the information settle. "And none of us knew. Isn't that fascinating?" He kept her hidden away like a little secret. "Maybe she's shy," Priya offered. "Or maybe," Charlotte said, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that still carried perfectly, "she doesn't quite fit into this world. Not everyone is comfortable among their betters." Nervous laughter rippled through the group. "Charlotte, That's harsh, Margot said, though she was smiling. I'm not being mean. I'm being honest. Charlotte placed a hand over her heart. The picture of wounded innocence. I actually feel sorry for her. Can you imagine? Being thrust into this life with no preparation, no sense of style, no connections, no understanding of how things work. It must be terrifying. She looks fine to me, said another woman at the table. Rebecca, a gallery owner who was newer to the group and still trying to prove herself. Charlotte's gaze snapped to her, sharp as a knife. Fine? Rebecca seemed to shrink under the attention. I just meant, she seems nice. Nice, Charlotte repeated, as if the word tasted bad. How quaint. But nice doesn't get you very far in our world, does it? You need presence, confidence. You need to understand the unspoken rules. She glanced back at Deja, her expression calculated. And you need to know when you're out of your depth. The table fell silent for a moment, processing the cruelty wrapped in concern. Then Margot laughed, a high, tinkling sound, and the spell broke. The conversation shifted, but the damage was done. The whispers began to spread. Deja felt it before she heard it. The shift in the room. The way conversation seemed to pause when she looked up. The way eyes darted in her direction, then quickly away. Are you all right? Alexander murmured, leaning close. I'm fine, Deja said automatically, but her stomach was knotting. During the salad course, butter lettuce with candied walnuts and goat cheese, Victoria leaned over again, her expression dripping with false sympathy. You know, Deja, she said quietly, if you ever need advice on navigating these events, I'm happy to help. I know how intimidating they can be when you're new to high society. I appreciate that, Deja said, forcing a smile. It's just that, well, there are expectations, unspoken rules about presentation, conversation, behavior. It's a lot to learn. Victoria's gaze drifted to Deja's pearls, simple, elegant, but not the cascade of diamonds most women wore. I'm sure Alexander wants you to feel confident. Have you considered hiring a stylist? Someone who specializes in events like this? The suggestion landed like a slap, disguised as help. I'm comfortable with my own style, Deja said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. Of course, of course. Victoria patted Deja's hand like she was a child. I'm just saying, there's no shame in asking for help. We all need guidance sometimes. Across the table, the Broadway producer's wife, Helen, jumped in. Victoria, leave the poor woman alone. She looks lovely. I'm only trying to be helpful, Victoria protested, her tone wounded. You're being condescending, Helen said bluntly. She turned to Deja with a genuine smile. Ignore her. You're perfect. Deja nodded her thanks, but the exchange had rattled her. She could feel the walls closing in, the judgments piling up like stones. Too simple, too quiet, too different. The main course arrived, filet mignon with truffle butter and roasted vegetables, and Deja forced herself to eat, though every bite felt mechanical. Alexander's hand found hers under the table again, squeezing gently. Do you want to leave? He whispered. No, Deja said firmly. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She wouldn't run. But then Charlotte rose from her seat. She moved with the confidence of someone who owned every space she entered, her white gown flowing behind her like a cape. She stopped at several tables on her way across the ballroom, greeting people, laughing, touching arms and shoulders with casual familiarity. She was working the room, gathering an audience, and she was headed straight for table 1. Oh no, Alexander muttered. Deja straightened in her chair, steeling herself. Charlotte arrived with a bright smile and a champagne flute in hand. "Alexander," she cooed, "I simply had to come back and congratulate you." "On what?" Alexander's tone was cool. "On your marriage, of course." Charlotte turned to Deja, her smile widening. "I've been thinking about it all evening, and I just feel terrible that we got off on the wrong foot earlier. I want to make it right." "That's not necessary," Deja said. "But it is." Charlotte placed a hand over her heart, her eyes wide with exaggerated sincerity. "I pride myself on being welcoming to newcomers. This world can be so exclusive, so difficult to break into, and I want you to know that I'm here for you." Deja didn't respond. She could feel the trap closing. "In fact," Charlotte continued, her voice rising slightly so nearby tables could hear, "I was just telling my friends how brave you are." "Brave?" Deja repeated, her guard up. "To show up here, looking so authentic, so true to yourself." Charlotte gestured to Deja's dress, her pearls, her understated makeup. "In a room full of people trying so hard to impress each other, you just don't care. And I think that's wonderful. Really. It takes courage to be so comfortable with simplicity." The compliment was poison. Everyone heard it. A few people at neighboring tables were watching now, phones discreetly angled to capture the moment. "Charlotte," Alexander said, his voice low and warning. "What?" Charlotte's eyes widened innocently. "I'm being sincere. I wish more women had Deja's confidence. To walk into the Metropolitan Gala wearing something you could buy off the rack, with jewelry that's practically costume. It's refreshing." "That's enough," Alexander said sharply. But Charlotte was on a roll, feeding off the attention, the growing audience. "I'm just saying, not everyone can afford custom Valentino or Harry Winston diamonds. And that's okay. There's no shame in being budget-conscious." The silence that followed was deafening. Deja felt every eye in the vicinity on her. She saw phones recording. She heard the sharp intake of breath from Helen. She felt Alexander tense beside her, ready to explode. But Deja spoke first, her voice calm and steady. "You're right," she said, meeting Charlotte's gaze without flinching. "I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here because my husband invited me. And I don't need designer labels or expensive jewelry to know my worth." Charlotte's smile faltered for just a second. She hadn't expected resistance. "Well," Charlotte said, recovering quickly, "I suppose that's one way to look at it. Though I'd argue that in this room, presentation does matter. It shows respect. It shows you understand the significance of events like this." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried. "Between you and me, darling, you might want to invest in a stylist, just for future events. Trust me, it'll make your life so much easier." "I think my wife," Alexander said, standing abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor, "is the most beautiful woman in this room. And if you or anyone else has a problem with that, you can take it up with me." The entire ballroom seemed to pause. Charlotte's mask slipped entirely. Her eyes flashed with something dark. Humiliation, rage, wounded pride. "I was only trying to help," she said, her voice tight. "No," Alexander said coldly, "you were trying to humiliate her, and it's not going to work." Charlotte's face flushed red. She wasn't used to being called out. She wasn't used to losing. She opened her mouth to respond, but Alexander cut her off. "I think it's time you went back to your table." For a moment, Charlotte stood frozen, her champagne flute trembling slightly in her hand. Then she straightened, her smile returning, sharp and brittle. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I didn't mean to cause a scene. Enjoy your evening." She turned and walked away, her head high, her gown swishing dramatically. But as she reached her own table, she looked back one last time, and Deja saw it clearly in her eyes. Cold, calculated fury. Charlotte Reed had been embarrassed, challenged, rejected, and she was going to make Deja pay for it. The tension in the ballroom shifted like a storm front moving in. After Charlotte's retreat, conversations resumed, but they were different now, quieter, more furtive. Heads bent together at nearby tables, eyes kept darting toward table 1, then toward table 7, where Charlotte sat surrounded by her friends, her laughter now sharp and brittle. Deja could feel it building. The whispers, the judgment, the entertainment value of watching two women circle each other like prize fighters. "We can leave," Alexander said again, his hand covering hers on the table. "Say the word, and we're gone." "No." Deja's voice was firmer than she felt. "I'm not running. That's what she wants." Alexander studied her face, concern etched in the lines around his eyes. "She's not going to let this go." "I know." And she did. Women like Charlotte never let things go. They couldn't. Their entire sense of self depended on winning, on being revered, on destroying anything that threatened their carefully constructed supremacy. The dessert course arrived, dark chocolate torte with gold leaf and raspberry coulis, but Deja barely tasted it. Her stomach was too tight, her nerves too frayed. That's when she heard Charlotte's voice again, louder now, clearly meant to carry. "I'm just saying, if someone can't afford to dress appropriately for an event like this, maybe they shouldn't attend." Charlotte's words floated across the ballroom like smoke. "It's disrespectful to the hosts, to the charity, to everyone who made an effort." "Charlotte, you're being awful," someone at her table said. Rebecca, the gallery owner, her voice uncomfortable. "I'm being honest," Charlotte shot back. "And honestly, I'm concerned. This is the Metropolitan Charity Gala, not a community center potluck. Standards matter." Margot's cackling laugh followed, and soon others joined in. Nervous, performative, the kind of laughter that said, "I'm laughing, so I'm not the target." Deja felt Alexander tense beside her. "I'm going to say something." "Don't," Deja said quietly, though her hands were clenched in her lap. "It'll only make it worse." "She's humiliating you." "She's humiliating herself." But even as Deja said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. Because Charlotte's cruelty was working. She could feel the room's energy changing, could sense people choosing sides, could see phones being positioned to capture whatever happened next. Charlotte rose from her table again. And this time there was something different in her movements. She'd had more champagne. Deja could see it in the slight unsteadiness of her gait, the exaggerated sway of her hips. But more than that, she'd tasted blood. And she wanted more. She didn't come directly to table 1 this time. Instead, she moved through the ballroom like a politician working a crowd, stopping at table after table, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It's just so important to maintain standards," she said to one group. "Once you start lowering the bar, where does it end?" At another table, "I'm all for diversity, truly I am. But there's a difference between inclusion and, well, letting just anyone waltz in." And finally, arriving at a table adjacent to table 1, she turned to face Deja directly. "I've been thinking," Charlotte announced, her voice projecting like an actress on stage, "about marriage, about partnership, about what it really means." The room quieted. People sensed something coming. "Because here's the thing, Charlotte continued, gesturing with her champagne flute. When someone marries up, and I mean significantly up, there's always a question, isn't there? About motivation. About intention. Charlotte, that's enough, Helen from Table 1 said sharply. But Charlotte was beyond stopping. The alcohol, the wounded pride, the desperate need to reassert dominance, it all came pouring out. I mean, let's be honest. A man like Alexander Styles, brilliant, powerful, worth billions, he could have anyone, literally anyone. So when he chooses someone so unexpected, well, people talk. What exactly are you implying? Alexander's voice was ice-cold, dangerous. Charlotte turned to him with wide, innocent eyes. I'm not implying anything. I'm simply observing that it's quite a leap, isn't it? From wherever she came from to all this. She gestured grandly at the opulent ballroom. Some might say it's a fairy tale. Others might call it opportunistic. A collective gasp rippled through nearby tables. Deja felt the words hit her like physical blows, not because they were true, but because they struck at her deepest insecurity. The fear that she didn't belong, that she hadn't earned her place, that people would always see her as an interloper who'd gotten lucky. You don't know anything about me, Deja said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. Don't I? Charlotte took a step closer, emboldened by the audience, by the phone's recording, by the feeling of holding the room in her palm. Let me guess. You met Alexander while you were working some humble little job, probably serving coffee or organizing files. He was charmed by your simplicity. Your lack of sophistication probably seemed refreshing after dealing with women who actually understand his world. You need to stop talking, Alexander said, standing now, his entire body rigid with barely controlled fury. But Charlotte was past caring. She was drunk on her own venom, on the attention, on the power of destruction. And then what happened? A whirlwind romance? A quick wedding before he could think too hard about it? Charlotte's smile was vicious. Very clever, really. Lock it down before he realizes what he's gotten himself into. That's not, Deja started to respond, but Charlotte cut her off. Oh, honey, please. We've all seen this story before. A beautiful face. A sob story about struggling and hardship. A man with more money than sense. It's textbook. Charlotte turned to address the wider audience now, playing to the crowd. I'm not judging truly. I admire the hustle, but let's not pretend this is some grand love story. This is a transaction, and everyone in this room knows it. The ballroom was dead silent now. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. Deja stood slowly, her legs shaking but her spine straight. You don't know anything about us, about our relationship, about who I am or where I come from or why Alexander and I are together. Then enlighten me, Charlotte challenged, taking another step forward. They were only a few feet apart now. Tell me your inspiring story. How you worked so hard. How you earned your place. How you deserve to be here among people who were actually born to this life. I don't have to justify myself to you. Of course you don't, Charlotte said with mock sympathy. But isn't it funny how the people who claim they don't care what others think are always the ones who are most insecure? That's enough. Alexander moved to step between them, but Deja held up her hand, stopping him. No, she said quietly. Let her finish. Let her show everyone exactly who she is. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. She hadn't expected Deja to hold her ground. She'd expected tears, anger, a breakdown she could use to prove her point. Who I am, Charlotte laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. I'm the woman who belongs here. I'm the woman who doesn't have to wonder if people are whispering about how I trapped my husband. I'm the woman who understands that breeding and class and standards matter. You're the woman, Deja said, her voice low and clear, who's so insecure in her own worth that she has to tear down others to feel important. The observation landed like a bomb. Charlotte's face flushed red. Her hands trembled. For a moment, she seemed to deflate, the mask slipping to reveal the desperate, frightened woman underneath. But then the champagne and wounded pride surged back, stronger than before. "How dare you?" Charlotte hissed, venom dripping from every word. "How dare you speak to me that way? Do you have any idea who I am? My family built this city, while yours was—" She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. "While my family was what?" Deja challenged, her voice like steel. "Say it! Finish your sentence." Charlotte's mouth opened and closed. Even in her drunken state, some instinct told her she was on dangerous ground. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Deja said. "You meant exactly what you were about to say. And now everyone here knows exactly what kind of person you are." The crowd murmured. Phones were definitely recording now, capturing every moment. Charlotte's friends at table 7 looked uncomfortable, some of them looking away. Charlotte's humiliation was complete. She had been exposed, her cruelty laid bare, her ugliness visible for all to see. And that's when she snapped. "You don't belong here," Charlotte snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "You will never belong here. You're nothing but a cheap, opportunistic little gold digger who trapped a lonely man, and everyone in this room knows it." The words echoed through the ballroom, harsh and final. Deja felt them settle over her like a shroud. Not because they were true, but because they'd been said out loud, in front of hundreds of people. And now they would live forever, in recordings, in gossip, in the stories people would tell. Alexander moved forward, fury written across his face. "You need to leave, now." But Charlotte wasn't done. She'd gone too far to back down. She'd crossed a line and couldn't find her way back. "I will not be insulted," she spat, "by some nobody who doesn't even know which fork to use." "Charlotte," Margot stood from table 7, her voice pleading, sensing the danger. But Charlotte was beyond reason. She took another step toward Deja, her hand rising, finger pointing accusingly. "Who do you think you are, coming into our world, wearing your cheap dress, with your cheap jewelry, pretending to be one of us? You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing him." Deja stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her expression calm despite the storm raging inside her. "I'm not pretending to be anything," she said quietly. "I'm just being myself. And if that threatens you this much, maybe you should ask yourself why." It was the final straw. Charlotte's face contorted with rage. Years of entitlement, of never being challenged, of always getting her way. It all came to a head in that moment. Her hand flew through the air with vicious speed. Crack! The slap connected with Deja's cheek, the sound echoing through the ballroom like a gunshot. Time seemed to stop. The music died. Conversations ceased mid-word. Every head turned at once. Deja's head had snapped to the side from the force of the blow. Her cheek burned, already reddening. Her eyes stung with tears, not from sadness, but from the sheer physical shock. Charlotte stood frozen, her hand still raised, her face a mixture of triumph and horror, as reality began to crash down on her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone screamed. Phones flashed as people scrambled to capture the moment. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "Did she just... Is someone recording this? Who is she? Who's the woman who got hit?" Nervous laughter bubbled up from somewhere in the back of the room, quickly silenced by shocked whispers. Deja slowly turned her head back to face Charlotte, her hand moving to her burning cheek. Her dark eyes blazed, but she didn't cry. She didn't crumble. She didn't give Charlotte the satisfaction. She simply stood there, dignified and unbroken, while the room erupted into chaos around her. Charlotte seemed to realize what she'd done. Her hand dropped. Her eyes widened. I didn't mean to. She provoked me." But no one was listening to her anymore. Because Alexander Styles was moving forward, his face a mask of cold fury that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. And behind him, cutting through the crowd like a force of nature, security was already moving toward the scene. The ballroom waited, holding its collective breath. What would Deja do? Would she scream? Cry? Strike back? But Deja didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her hand on her cheek, her eyes locked on Charlotte with an expression that was somehow more powerful than any words could be. And that's when Alexander stepped between them, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Did you just put your hands on my wife?" The words carried through the ballroom, crystal clear, devastating in their simplicity. My wife. Charlotte's face drained of color as the full weight of what she'd done crashed down on her. She hadn't just slapped some random woman. She'd assaulted the wife of one of the most powerful men in the country, in front of 500 witnesses, on camera. The room exploded into motion, people standing, shouting, security pushing through the crowd. But all Deja could see was Alexander's face, and all she could feel was the burning handprint on her cheek. And somewhere in the chaos, she heard Charlotte's voice, thin and desperate. No, wait, I didn't know. I didn't realize. But it was too late. The damage was done. The ballroom held its breath. Alexander Styles stood between his wife and Charlotte Reed, his 6'3" frame casting a long shadow in the chandelier light. His tailored tuxedo was immaculate, his posture rigid with controlled fury. But it was his eyes, those steel-gray eyes that had stared down corporate sharks and hostile takeover attempts, that made Charlotte take an involuntary step backward. "I asked you a question," Alexander said, his voice low and deadly calm. "Did you just put your hands on my wife?" My wife. The words ricocheted through the crowd like bullets. His wife? Wait, she's married to Alexander Styles? I thought she was just a guest. Oh my God, Charlotte just hit Alexander Styles's wife. The whispers crescendoed into a roar of shocked voices. Phones that had been recording now swiveled frantically between Charlotte's pale face and Deja's reddened cheek. The atmosphere shifted from cruel entertainment to genuine horror as the full scope of what had just happened settled over the room. Charlotte's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Her champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the sudden quiet that followed. Alexander, Charlotte's voice cracked. The arrogance that had carried her through the evening evaporated like morning fog. She didn't say she was my wife? Alexander's tone was glacial. So that makes it acceptable? You needed to know who she was connected to before deciding whether or not to assault her? Charlotte flinched at the word assault. It made everything real, legal, serious. No, I thought. Charlotte's eyes darted around desperately, looking for support, for allies, for anyone who might save her from this moment. But her friends at table 7 were looking away, suddenly very interested in their desserts. Margot had her phone out, filming. Priya had her hand over her mouth in shock. No one was coming to rescue Charlotte Reed. "You thought what?" Alexander pressed, taking a step forward. His voice never rose above conversational volume, but somehow that made it more terrifying. "You thought she was nobody. You thought she was fair game for your cruelty because she wasn't wearing the right label? Because she didn't fit your narrow definition of who belongs? We were just talking and things got heated, and things got heated," Alexander repeated, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Is that what we're calling physical violence now? Things getting heated?" Security had reached the perimeter of the confrontation. 3 large men in dark suits waiting for direction. The event coordinator, Margaret, hovered nearby. Her clipboard clutched to her chest, her face a mask of panic. This was a PR nightmare unfolding in real time. But Alexander ignored them all. His focus was entirely on Charlotte. "Do you know what I saw when I walked in here?" he asked, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to strain to hear. "I saw my wife, the kindest, most dignified woman I've ever known, standing here with your handprint on her face. I saw her refusing to lower herself to your level, even as you tried your damnedest to humiliate her." Deja touched his arm gently. "Alexander, it's okay. It's not okay," he said, turning to look at her. His expression softened for just a moment, his hand coming up to gently touch her reddened cheek. "None of this is okay." He turned back to Charlotte, and the coldness returned. "Let me tell you who you just attacked," Alexander said, his voice now carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. He wasn't just speaking to Charlotte anymore, he was addressing everyone. "Deja Styles works with inner-city youth literacy programs. She spends her days in communities that people like you," he gestured toward Charlotte and her table, "pretend don't exist. She coordinates volunteers, raises money, fights for children who've been abandoned by a system that's supposed to protect them." Charlotte's face was chalk white now. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. "She has a master's degree in education policy from Columbia," Alexander continued, each word precisely placed like a scalpel cut. "She's published research on literacy intervention strategies. She's transformed programs that were failing into programs that are saving lives. And she does all of this not for recognition, not for status, but because she genuinely believes every child deserves a chance." The crowd murmured, the energy shifting again. People who had been filming Charlotte's cruelty with amusement were now looking at Deja with new eyes. "So when you stand here in your designer gown," Alexander said, his gaze boring into Charlotte, "mocking her dress, questioning her worth, implying she's some kind of opportunist, you're not just being cruel. You're revealing exactly how shallow and empty your own life is." "Alexander, please." Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper now. Tears were forming in her eyes, but they looked more like panic than remorse. "I made a mistake. I had too much champagne. I didn't know who she was." "There it is again," Alexander cut her off sharply. "You didn't know who she was. As if that matters. As if respect and basic human decency should only be extended to people you deem important enough. He took another step forward, and Charlotte actually stumbled backward, her heel catching on her gown. "My wife doesn't need my name or my money to have value," Alexander said, and his voice finally rose, filling every corner of the massive ballroom. "Her worth doesn't come from me. It comes from who she is, from her compassion, her integrity, her strength. The fact that you can't see that says everything about you and nothing about her." A smattering of applause started somewhere in the back of the room. Then more people joined in. Within seconds, the ballroom erupted in applause, not polite charity gala clapping, but genuine, thunderous approval. Charlotte looked around wildly, seeing her social standing crumbling in real time. People who had laughed at her jokes an hour ago were now applauding her public dismantling. "I'm sorry," Charlotte blurted out, her voice high and desperate. "I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking. I don't know what came over me. Please, Alexander. Deja. I'm sorry." "Sorry you did it?" Alexander asked coldly. "Or sorry you got caught? Sorry you assaulted someone? Or sorry that someone turned out to be connected to me?" Charlotte's mouth worked soundlessly. She couldn't answer because they both knew the truth. "Let me be very clear about something," Alexander said, his voice dropping back to that dangerously quiet tone. "I built my company from nothing. I know what it's like to be dismissed, underestimated, judged for not fitting in. And I promised myself that if I ever had power, I would use it to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." He moved to stand beside Deja, his hand finding hers, their fingers intertwining. "My wife doesn't need my protection," he continued, looking at Deja with unmistakable love and pride. "She's more than capable of standing up for herself. But I'll be damned if I'm going to stand by and watch someone assault her because they think they can get away with it." Charlotte was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks, her carefully constructed facade completely destroyed. "Please," she whispered. "Please, I'm begging you. I made a terrible mistake. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever you want. Just please, don't—" She couldn't even finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Everyone knew what she was afraid of. Alexander Styles could destroy her with a phone call. He could have her blacklisted from every charity event, every social gathering, every opportunity that made up her carefully curated life. He could ruin her husband's business deals, freeze her family out of circles they'd belonged to for generations. And everyone in the room knew he had the power to do it. "You'll do whatever I want," Alexander repeated, his tone almost curious. "What I want is for you to understand that actions have consequences. What I want is for you to realize that the people you look down on are often worth 100 of you. What I want is for everyone here to remember this moment the next time they're tempted to judge someone based on appearances." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But most of all," he said, his voice hardening again, "what I want is for you to never come near my wife again." Charlotte nodded frantically, tears and mascara streaking her face. "I won't. I swear. I'm so sorry." The apology hung in the air, hollow and desperate. It wasn't remorse. It was self-preservation. Everyone could hear it. Victoria from Table 1 spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension. "Charlotte, I think you should leave." "Yes," Margaret, the event coordinator, added quickly, sensing an opportunity to contain the damage. "Perhaps it's best if you—" "I'm not finished," Alexander said quietly, and everyone fell silent again. He looked around the ballroom, making eye contact with various guests, The ones who had laughed at Charlotte's jokes, the ones who had whispered about Deja, the ones who had stood by and watched the cruelty unfold. "This isn't just about Charlotte Reed," he said. "This is about a culture that values the wrong things, that measures worth in dollars and designer labels, that treats people as disposable if they don't fit a certain mold." The ballroom was silent except for Charlotte's quiet sobbing. "My wife came here tonight because I asked her to," Alexander continued. "She didn't want to. She knew she'd be judged. She knew people would make assumptions. But she came anyway because she loves me and wanted to support me." He looked down at Deja, and his voice softened. "And what did she get for that? Insults, mockery, and finally, violence." He turned back to the crowd. "So yes, Charlotte Reed owes my wife an apology. But so does everyone else who participated in this, everyone who laughed, everyone who recorded it for entertainment, everyone who made my wife feel like she didn't belong." Uncomfortable silence. People looking at their phones, at their plates, anywhere but at Alexander's accusing gaze. "This ends now," Alexander said firmly. "Not just here, but everywhere. People's value doesn't come from their bank accounts or their family trees. It comes from their character, and anyone who can't understand that isn't welcome in my life or at my table." Charlotte was shaking now, her entire body trembling. Her white gown, so pristine and perfect hours ago, was wrinkled and stained with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, looking at Deja for the first time since the slap. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was cruel. I was everything you said. Please, please forgive me." The words tumbled out in a rush. Desperate and broken, but there was something hollow in them, something performative. Charlotte's eyes kept darting around the room, calculating, trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of her reputation. Deja studied her for a long moment, her hand still pressed to her burning cheek. Then she spoke, her voice quiet, but clear enough to carry through the silent ballroom. "I don't know if you're actually sorry," Deja said, "or if you're just sorry you got caught. Sorry that I turned out to be someone important enough to matter." Charlotte opened her mouth to protest, but Deja held up her hand. "But I do know this," Deja continued. "Real remorse isn't about words. It's about change. It's about looking at yourself and deciding to be better. And I don't think you're there yet." The observation landed with devastating accuracy. Charlotte flinched as if she'd been slapped again. "So no," Deja said firmly. "I don't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because forgiveness isn't something you can demand or manipulate your way into. It has to be earned." Alexander squeezed her hand, pride evident in his expression. Charlotte stood frozen, her apology rejected, her power completely evaporated. She looked around desperately one more time, hoping for someone, anyone, to defend her. But no one spoke up. No one moved to help her. She was alone. "I think," Margaret said gently but firmly, "it's time for you to go, Charlotte." Charlotte nodded mutely, her face crumpling. She turned to leave, her heels clicking against the marble, each step echoing like a death knell for her social standing. But as she reached the edge of the ballroom, something happened. Her phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. She pulled it out with shaking hands, and her face went even paler as she read the screen. Texts. From her husband, from her parents, from her siblings, all asking the same thing. What have you done? Because videos of the slap were already going viral, already spreading across social media. already being shared with commentary about entitled rich people, about racism, about the cruelty of high society. Charlotte's mistake wasn't just social anymore. It was public, permanent, documented, and everyone she knew was already seeing it. Charlotte stood at the edge of the ballroom, her phone trembling in her hands, her face illuminated by the harsh glow of the screen. Around her, the crowd watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, slowly, Charlotte turned back to face the room. Her shoulders began to shake. Soft sobs escaped her lips. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her diamond rings catching the chandelier light. "I don't know what to say," Charlotte said, her voice breaking. I'm mortified. Absolutely mortified." She took a few hesitant steps back toward the center of the ballroom, and several guests instinctively shifted to give her space. Her white gown trailed behind her, stained now with champagne and mascara. "I've never done anything like this before," Charlotte continued, tears streaming freely down her face. "I don't know what came over me. The champagne, the stress, but that's no excuse." "There's no excuse for what I did." She looked directly at Deja, her eyes red and pleading. "I am so sorry. Not because of who you're married to, but because what I did was wrong, unforgivable." The performance was masterful. Her voice wavered in all the right places. Her body language radiated shame and contrition. Even her tears seemed perfectly calibrated, enough to show genuine emotion, but not so much that she looked hysterical. Some guests exchanged glances, their expressions softening slightly. People wanted to believe in redemption, in second chances. Charlotte was giving them a narrative they could work with. "Please," Charlotte whispered, taking another step forward. "Please let me make this right somehow. I'll do anything." Alexander's grip on Deja's hand tightened. "Don't," he murmured under his breath. "She's manipulating the situation." But Deja was watching Charlotte carefully, studying her face, her body language, the way her eyes kept darting to the crowd to gauge their reaction. "Anything?" Deja asked quietly. Charlotte's head snapped toward her, hope flickering across her tear-stained face. "Yes, anything. Tell me what I can do to prove how sorry I am." The ballroom waited, collectively holding its breath. Deja gently extracted her hand from Alexander's and took a few steps toward Charlotte, not close enough to be threatening, but close enough that their conversation would be heard by everyone. "You want to prove you're sorry?" Deja asked, her voice steady and clear. "Yes," Charlotte said eagerly. "Please, give me a chance." Deja was silent for a moment, considering. Then she spoke, her words deliberate and measured. "Words are easy, Charlotte. Apologies cost nothing when they're just performed for an audience." She gestured around the ballroom. "But if you truly want to demonstrate remorse, if you genuinely want to change, then it requires action." "Anything," Charlotte repeated, nodding frantically. "I'll do anything you ask." "The communities I work in, the ones you implied were beneath you, they need help, real help. Not just charitable donations written off on tax returns, but actual human presence." Deja's voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath. "If you want redemption, earn it. Volunteer in Harlem, in the Bronx, in the communities you've spent your life looking down on." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded approvingly. "Spend time with the children I work with," Deja continued. "Listen to their stories, understand their struggles, see them as human beings worthy of respect, not as problems to be solved from a comfortable distance." Charlotte's face was unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded, fresh tears spilling over. "Yes," she whispered. Yes, I'll do that. I will. I promise. Not just once, Deja pressed. Not a photo opportunity for your Instagram. Real commitment. 6 months. Every week. Showing up. Doing the work. Proving through actions that you've learned something. I will, Charlotte said, her voice stronger now. I swear to you, I will. This has been a wake-up call. I've been living in a bubble, and tonight, you popped it. She let out a shaky laugh that sounded almost genuine. Maybe this was what I needed, to be humbled, to understand that there's more to life than designer labels and social status. The crowd was warming to the narrative now. People loved a redemption story, especially when it came with a clear path to forgiveness. Victoria from Table 1 stood up. I think that's very gracious of you, Deja, to offer Charlotte a path forward. It's more than she deserves, Helen added, but there was approval in her tone. Even Margaret, the event coordinator, looked relieved. A scandal with a redemptive ending was better than pure disaster. The charity could still salvage this evening's narrative. Charlotte took another step toward Deja, her hands clasped together almost prayerfully. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving me this chance. I won't waste it. I promise you won't regret this. For a moment, it seemed like the crisis had passed, like the evening might end with a lesson learned and a path toward healing. Deja studied Charlotte's face, wanting to believe the transformation was real, wanting to think that her grace had actually reached someone. I hope you mean that, Deja said quietly. I do, Charlotte insisted. I really do. This has been the worst night of my life, but maybe it needed to be. Maybe this is how I finally become the person I should have been all along. Light applause started somewhere in the back of the room. Then more people joined in. Within moments, the ballroom was applauding, not as thunderously as they had for Alexander's speech, but with a sense of relief and approval. The crowd wanted this story. Woman makes terrible mistake. Woman is called out. Woman sees the error of her ways. Woman commits to change. It was neat, contained, satisfying. Charlotte even managed a tremulous smile, acknowledging the applause with a small nod. She looked around the room, and for just a second, something flickered across her face. Something that might have been satisfaction. But then her phone buzzed again, and again. The sound was audible in the moment of relative quiet, following the applause. Charlotte glanced down at her phone, and her expression shifted, just for a flash, but Deja caught it. The screen was filled with notifications, text messages, missed calls, social media alerts. Charlotte's thumb moved across the screen, her eyes scanning rapidly. Deja watched as Charlotte's face transformed, the tearful contrition fading, replaced by something harder. Calculating. Buzz, buzz, buzz. More messages. Charlotte's jaw clenched. She looked up from her phone, and her eyes found someone across the ballroom. Her husband, Marcus, who had finally arrived. He was standing near the entrance, his face pale, his phone also pressed to his ear. Their eyes met across the crowded space. He shook his head slightly, and even from a distance, Deja could see the anger in his expression. Charlotte's phone buzzed one more time. She looked down at the screen, and this time she read for longer. Her face went through a series of micro-expressions, shock, then anger, then something that looked almost like amusement. When she looked up again, something had shifted. The mask was slipping. "Charlotte?" Deja said, a warning note in her voice. Charlotte's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You know what's funny?" she said, her voice different now, harder, sharper. The tears were still on her face, but the vulnerability was gone. "Charlotte, don't!" Margot called from table 7, sensing danger. But Charlotte was beyond listening. She held up her phone, the screen still glowing. "I just got a text from my mother." "Do you know what she said?" No one answered. The ballroom had gone very quiet again, the brief moment of resolution evaporating. "She said, 'How could you be so stupid?'" Charlotte's laugh was bitter. Not, "How could you hit someone?" Not, "How could you be so cruel?" But, "How could you be so stupid?" She looked directly at Deja, and her eyes were cold now. "Because apparently, the problem isn't what I did. The problem is who I did it to." "Charlotte, stop talking." Marcus was pushing through the crowd now, urgency in his movements. But Charlotte ignored him. The floodgates had opened, and everything she'd been holding back came pouring out. "You want to know what else my family is saying?" Charlotte's voice was rising now, the careful modulation gone. "They're worried about business deals, about social standing, about the Styles name, and what Alexander might do to us." She took a step toward Deja, and Alexander immediately moved to intercept, but Charlotte held up her hand. "But nobody, not one single person, has asked me if I'm okay, if I'm hurt, if I need help." Her voice cracked, but this time it wasn't a performance. It was something rawer, more desperate. "Because I don't matter. I've never mattered. I'm just a trophy they parade around, a pretty face to make them look good." "That doesn't excuse what you did," Deja said quietly. "I know that," Charlotte snapped. "God, don't you think I know that? But you want to stand there and lecture me about redemption? About volunteering in Harlem like some kind of penance?" The tears were flowing again, but these were different. Angry tears. Frustrated tears. "You think you're better than me because you work with poor kids?" Charlotte's voice dripped with venom now. "Because you've convinced yourself you're doing it out of the goodness of your heart. And not because it makes for a nice story when people ask what the billionaire's wife does with her time." "That's enough," Alexander said sharply. But Charlotte was on a roll now, months or maybe years of resentment pouring out in a toxic flood. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you," Charlotte said, taking another step forward. Her voice dropped to something almost conversational, which somehow made it more chilling. "I see someone who got lucky, who was in the right place at the right time, who said the right things and wore the right mask, and convinced a lonely billionaire that she was different from all the other women throwing themselves at him." "You don't know anything about us," Deja said. But there was a tremor in her voice now. "Don't I?" Charlotte's smile was cruel. "I know exactly how this works. I married into money too, remember? I know what it takes. The performance, the carefully cultivated image, the way you make them feel like you're not interested in their money, even as you're calculating exactly what your life will look like once you have access to it." She moved closer, close enough now that only Deja and Alexander could hear her next words clearly. "The difference between us," Charlotte whispered, her voice low and poisonous, "is that I'm honest about it. I know I'm a trophy wife. I know I married for money and status and security. But you've convinced everyone, maybe even yourself, that you're somehow different. Somehow pure." Her eyes glittered with malice. "But you're not. You're just like me. Just another gold digger who got lucky." The words hit Deja like a physical blow, striking directly at her deepest insecurity. "You're just better at hiding it," Charlotte finished, her smile vicious and triumphant. The mask had completely fallen away now, revealing the wounded, vicious woman underneath. All the apologies, all the tears, all the promises of redemption. They'd been nothing but a performance, a desperate attempt to salvage what she could from the wreckage. But Charlotte had given up on salvage. Now she just wanted to inflict pain. Deja stood frozen, Charlotte's words echoing in her mind. Gold digger, gold digger. Gold digger. Around them, the ballroom erupted into chaos. Guests who had been moved by Charlotte's repentance now recoiled in disgust. Security moved forward. Marcus finally reached his wife, grabbing her arm. "Charlotte, we're leaving. Now." But Charlotte jerked away from him, her attention still fixed on Deja. Truth hurts, doesn't it? And for just a moment, Deja couldn't respond, because somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, "What if she's right?" The silence that followed Charlotte's accusation was suffocating. Deja stood frozen, Charlotte's words echoing in her mind like a malicious chant. Gold digger, just like me. Better at hiding it. Around them, the ballroom had transformed into something else entirely. No longer a charity gala, but a gladiatorial arena, with 500 spectators waiting to see who would draw blood next. Charlotte saw the impact of her words and pressed her advantage. The tears were gone now, replaced by something sharp and calculating. If she was going down, she would drag Deja with her. "Oh, did I strike a nerve?" Charlotte's voice carried through the ballroom, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The truth usually does." "You don't know what you're talking about," Deja said, but her voice wavered. The confidence she'd maintained throughout the evening was cracking. "Don't I?" Charlotte laughed, the sound harsh and brittle. "Let me paint a picture for everyone here. A young woman from, where was it? Detroit? Atlanta?" "Atlanta," Deja said quietly. "Atlanta," Charlotte repeated. "A young woman from Atlanta, working a dead-end non-profit job, barely making rent. And then one day, like Cinderella at the ball, she meets a billionaire." Marcus was pulling at Charlotte's arm now, his voice urgent. "Charlotte, for God's sake, stop!" But Charlotte shook him off violently. "No, I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of acting like we don't all see exactly what this is." She turned back to the crowd, addressing them directly now, her voice rising with each word. "Alexander Styles, one of the richest, most powerful men in the country, just happens to fall madly in love with a woman who has nothing, no wealth, no connections, no social standing, and we're all supposed to believe it's a fairy tale? That it's true love?" "It is," Alexander said, his voice dangerous. But Charlotte ignored him. "Please," Charlotte scoffed. "I've been in this world long enough to know how it works. Women like her," she jabbed a finger toward Deja, "they see a lonely man with more money than God, and they see an opportunity, a way out, a ticket to a life they could never have on their own." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people looked shocked, horrified by Charlotte's cruelty, but others were whispering to each other, their expressions thoughtful, considering. Could it be true? It does seem suspicious. 3 years married, and none of us knew? Why would he hide her unless there was something to hide? Deja could feel the room turning, could sense the doubt spreading like poison through water. "You think I'm being cruel?" Charlotte addressed the crowd again. "I'm being realistic. Look at her." She gestured at Deja with barely concealed contempt. "Simple dress, simple jewelry, simple everything. She's playing the humble card perfectly. The I'm not interested in your money routine. The I'm here for love act." "That's enough!" Alexander roared, his composure finally cracking. But Charlotte was unstoppable now, riding a wave of self-destructive rage. "Is it enough? Is it really? Because I'm just saying what everyone here is thinking but is too polite to say out loud." Charlotte's eyes glittered with malicious triumph. She saw an opportunity and she took it. She probably researched him, found out he liked charitable women, compassionate women. So she positioned herself perfectly, worked at a nonprofit, tutored underprivileged kids, made herself into exactly the kind of woman who would appeal to a man who'd already had everything else. "Stop it," Deja whispered, but the words were too quiet to carry. And then what happened? Charlotte was building to something now, her voice taking on the cadence of a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. A chance meeting? How convenient. Was it really chance? Or did she arrange it? Did she find out where he volunteered, where he got his coffee, where he spent his rare free moments? "You're insane," Alexander said flatly. "Am I? Or am I the only honest person in this room?" Charlotte spun to face him directly. "Tell me, Alexander, how exactly did you meet? What's the story you've been telling people?" Alexander's jaw clenched. "That's none of your business." "That's what I thought," Charlotte said with satisfaction. "Because the story probably sounds a little too perfect, doesn't it? A little too serendipitous?" She turned back to Deja, moving closer despite Marcus's attempts to restrain her. "And once she had her hooks in, once she'd convinced you she was different, special, authentic, how long did it take before there was a proposal? A year? 6 months? 8 months, Deja heard herself say, hating that she was engaging but unable to stop. 8 months! Charlotte's voice dripped with vindication. 8 months, from meeting to marriage. Now why would someone rush into marriage that quickly, unless they were afraid the mark might wise up? The whispers grew louder now. Even some of Alexander's business associates were exchanging meaningful glances. 8 months is fast, especially for someone like Alexander. He was never the impulsive type. Deja felt the walls closing in. Every insecurity she'd ever had about her relationship with Alexander came flooding back. All the times she'd wondered if she deserved him. All the moments she'd questioned whether she truly belonged in his world. All the fears that someday he would wake up and realize he'd made a mistake. And the secret wedding, Charlotte continued, sensing victory. Hidden away from friends and family. Why? Because she knew that if anyone actually got close enough to examine the relationship, they might see through it. Our wedding was private because that's how we wanted it, Alexander said through gritted teeth. Or because she wanted to lock it down before anyone could talk you out of it, Charlotte shot back. Before your lawyers could suggest a prenup. Before your family could investigate her background, before anyone could warn you that you were being played. I signed a prenup, Deja said suddenly, her voice stronger now. A comprehensive one. If we divorce, I get nothing. The revelation rippled through the crowd. Even Charlotte faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. A long game play, how clever. Take nothing in the divorce but live like a queen while you're married, and work on making yourself indispensable. Become the perfect wife. Support his causes. Stand by his side. Make him dependent on you emotionally, so that even if the marriage ends, he'll still support you out of guilt or nostalgia, or whatever emotion you've managed to manipulate. You're twisting everything, Deja said, her voice shaking now. Not with fear, but with rage and hurt, and the terrible weight of having her most intimate relationship dissected and perverted in front of hundreds of strangers. I'm revealing the truth, Charlotte shot back. And you know what the worst part is? You've done such a good job of it. The humble act, the charity work, the simple style, it's all so perfectly calculated. You've made yourself into the anti-trophy wife, which is just another kind of performance, another kind of trap. Deja's breath was coming faster now. Her hands were trembling. The red mark from Charlotte's slap burned on her cheek like a brand. "You don't know anything about me," she managed to say. "About us. About why we're together." "I know this." Charlotte stepped even closer, her voice dropping but still carrying through the silent ballroom. "Deep down, in the part of yourself you don't let anyone see, not even him, you know I'm right. You know that without his money, without his name, without his status, you're nothing special. Just another struggling non-profit worker who would have spent her life barely making ends meet." The words hit like bullets, each one finding its mark in Deja's most vulnerable places. "You're projecting," Deja whispered. "Everything you're saying, it's all about you. Your life, your emptiness." "Maybe," Charlotte conceded with a bitter smile, "but that doesn't make me wrong about you." She leaned in close enough that her next words were meant only for Deja, though in the pin-drop silence, others heard them too. "You lie awake at night wondering if he'll realize his mistake, don't you? You look at yourself in the mirror and wonder how long you can keep up the act. You watch him in his world, the real world of money and power, and you feel like an imposter. Because that's what you are, an imposter who got lucky. And someday, the luck will run out." Tears burned in Deja's eyes, not because the accusations were true, but because Charlotte had somehow found every insecurity, every doubt, every fear that Deja had ever had about herself, and weaponized them. "Stop," Deja said, her voice breaking. Why, because it hurts? Good. It should hurt. The truth always hurts." Around them, the ballroom was in chaos. Some people were outraged by Charlotte's attack. Others were nodding thoughtfully, convinced. Still others were simply transfixed by the spectacle, unable to look away. Alexander moved to stand in front of Deja, blocking Charlotte's view of her. "I'm warning you for the last time," he said, his voice lethal. "Step away from my wife." "Your wife," Charlotte repeated mockingly. "Your purchased wife, your trophy. Your midlife crisis made flesh." "Security!" Margaret's voice finally cut through the chaos. "Get her out of here!" 3 security guards rushed forward, but Charlotte wasn't finished. "You can throw me out," she shouted, her voice echoing off the marble and crystal. "But you can't throw out the truth. Everyone in this room knows exactly what she is. They're just too polite to say it to your face, Alexander." The guards reached her, taking her arms. Marcus was there too, his face red with embarrassment and fury. "Let me go!" Charlotte struggled against their grip, but they were already moving her toward the exit. "Ask yourself, Alexander. Ask yourself why a woman like her would want a man like you if not for the money. Ask yourself if you'd be together if you were broke. Ask yourself." Her voice cut off as they pulled her through the doorway and into the corridor beyond. But the damage was done. The poison had spread. Deja stood trembling, tears streaming down her face now, the facade of composure completely shattered. Alexander's arms were around her, but she barely felt them. All she could hear was Charlotte's voice over and over. "You know I'm right. You're nothing special. You're an imposter. Gold digger, gold digger, gold digger." The ballroom was a cacophony of voices now, some defending Deja, some debating Charlotte's accusations, some already pulling out phones to spread the gossip further. Deja felt like she was drowning in front of 500 people. And then, cutting through the chaos like a knife through silk, a voice rang out from the back of the ballroom. "That is quite enough." Every head turned. An elderly man was standing, his posture ramrod straight despite his age. He was distinguished, silver-haired, his tuxedo impeccably tailored. His face was weathered but kind, his eyes sharp with intelligence. Dr. Marcus Chen, one of the most respected philanthropists in New York, founder of 3 major charitable foundations, a man whose word carried weight in every room he entered. He'd been sitting quietly at one of the back tables all evening, observing. Now he stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent ballroom, "that some context is needed here. And as I am perhaps the only person in this room who witnessed the beginning of Alexander and Deja's relationship, I feel obligated to provide it." Alexander's head snapped toward him, surprise evident on his face. Dr. Chen smiled slightly. "You didn't know I was there, did you, Alexander? At the community center that day 3 years ago? But I was. I saw everything." He began walking slowly toward the front of the ballroom, and the crowd parted to let him through. "And I think," Dr. Chen continued, his eyes sweeping across the assembled guests, "it's time everyone heard the truth." Dr. Marcus Chen moved through the ballroom with the unhurried confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. At 73, he had built an empire of charitable foundations, advised 3 presidents, and earned the respect of everyone from corporate titans to street-level community organizers. When he spoke, people listened. "I apologize for remaining silent until now," Dr. Chen said, his voice clear and measured, "but I needed to hear the full scope of Mrs. Reed's accusations before I could address them properly." He reached the center of the ballroom, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. His eyes found Deja first, offering her a small, reassuring nod before scanning the crowd. "3 years ago," he began, "I was visiting the Harlem Community Center on 125th Street. I was considering a significant donation to their youth literacy program, and I wanted to see the operation firsthand before committing funds." The ballroom was absolutely silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving. "The program coordinator took me on a tour," Dr. Chen continued, "and in one of the reading rooms, I observed a young woman working with a group of children. She was patient, engaged, and clearly beloved by the students. When one boy, maybe 9 years old, threw his book across the room in frustration, she didn't scold him. She sat beside him and asked what was wrong." Dr. Chen's expression softened at the memory. "The boy said he was stupid, that reading was too hard, and he would never get it. And this young woman, Deja, looked him in the eye and told him something I've never forgotten. She said, 'You're not stupid. The system failed you, but I'm here now, and I'm not giving up on you, which means you don't get to give up on yourself.'" Several people in the crowd murmured appreciatively. Deja felt Alexander's hand tighten around hers. "I was so impressed," Dr. Chen said, "that I asked the program coordinator about her. He told me she'd been volunteering there for 2 years, 40 hours a week on top of her paid position at another nonprofit. She wasn't being compensated. She was there because she believed in the work." He paused, letting that sink in. "After my tour, I stayed to observe the end of the session, and that's when I saw a well-dressed man enter the reading room. He looked out of place, expensive suit, clearly uncomfortable in the environment. But he'd come to volunteer, just as I had come to observe." "Alexander," Deja breathed, understanding now. Dr. Chen nodded. "Alexander Styles. I recognized him, of course, and I watched what happened next with great interest." He turned to face the crowd more fully, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. Alexander had come to read to the children. The coordinator introduced him to Deja, asking if she could help him get oriented. And do you know what Deja's first words to him were? No one answered. They were transfixed. She said, "We don't need another person coming here to feel good about themselves for an hour. These kids can smell insincerity a mile away. So if you're not serious about this, if you're just here for a photo op or to ease your conscience, you can leave now." Surprised laughter rippled through the ballroom. Even Alexander smiled at the memory. She had no idea who he was, Dr. Chen continued. Or she didn't care. And Alexander, to his credit, didn't pull rank or take offense. He simply said he was serious. So Deja handed him a book and told him to prove it. Dr. Chen's expression grew warmer as he continued. I watched them for the next hour. Deja worked with her students while Alexander read to a small group. She corrected him twice, once when he was reading too fast, once when he wasn't letting the children participate enough, and Alexander took her feedback without ego. When the session ended, I saw them talk briefly. Just a few minutes. She thanked him for coming and told him he was welcome back if he wanted to be useful, not because of who he was or what he could donate, but because he'd actually shown up and done the work. Dr. Chen looked directly at Deja now. That young woman had no idea she was speaking to a billionaire. She treated him exactly as she would treat anyone else, with honesty, with high expectations, and with the understanding that everyone who entered that space was there to serve the children, not themselves. He turned back to the crowd, his voice growing stronger. Over the following months, I continued to visit that community center, and I watched Deja Styles return, week after week. Not for publicity. There were no photographers, no press releases, just a man showing up to read to children because someone had challenged him to be useful. And I watched Deja, Dr. Chen continued. I watched her treat Alexander exactly as she treated every other volunteer. She expected excellence. She demanded commitment. She called him out when he missed a week without notice, and slowly, very slowly, I watched them become friends. The ballroom was utterly silent now, hanging on every word. I saw the moment Alexander fell in love with her, Dr. Chen said softly. It was about 4 months in. One of Deja's students, the same boy who'd thrown his book that first day, had just finished reading an entire chapter on his own for the first time. Deja's face lit up with such genuine joy, such pure pride in this child's achievement, that I saw Alexander stop and stare at her, like he'd been struck by lightning. Several women in the audience made soft sounds of appreciation. Even some of the men looked moved. And I saw the moment Deja fell in love with him, Dr. Chen continued. It was 2 weeks later. Alexander had brought supplies, new books, reading aids, things the program desperately needed but couldn't afford. When Deja asked where they came from, he said he'd found them and didn't want them to go to waste. Dr. Chen smiled at the memory. It was the most transparent lie I'd ever heard. But Deja pretended to believe it because she understood what he was doing. He was giving without taking credit. He was helping without making it about himself. And in that moment, I saw her look at him differently. Not as a volunteer or a colleague, but as someone who truly understood what mattered. He paused, letting the story settle over the room like a blanket. So when Mrs. Reed accuses Deja of being a gold digger who calculated her way into Alexander's life, Dr. Chen's voice hardened. She is not just wrong. She is revealing her own inability to comprehend that some people are motivated by things other than money and status. The crowd murmured agreement, the tide definitively turning now. Deja didn't pursue Alexander. She didn't even know who he was for weeks. When she finally found out, she was angry that he hadn't told her. because she thought it meant he'd been dishonest. They had their first fight over it, right there in the community center, where I happened to be meeting with the director. Dr. Chen's eyes swept across the assembled guests, making contact with as many as possible. I have spent my entire life working in philanthropy. I have met thousands of people, rich and poor, genuine and calculating, and I can tell you without hesitation that Deja Styles is one of the most authentic, dedicated, selfless people I have ever encountered. I funded that literacy program, he continued, not because of Alexander, but because of her. Because I believed in her vision, her commitment, her absolute refusal to accept anything less than excellence for children everyone else had written off. He turned to face Deja directly, his expression kind but firm. Young lady, I have been watching you for 3 years. I have seen the work you do, the lives you've changed, the dedication you bring to every single day. And I want you to know that you belong anywhere you choose to be, not because of who you married, but because of who you are. Tears were streaming down Deja's face now, but they were different tears. Not tears of humiliation, but of validation, of being seen. The ballroom erupted in applause. It started with Helen at table 1, then spread rapidly through the room. Within seconds, people were standing, applauding not just politely, but enthusiastically. Some were even cheering. Dr. Chen nodded graciously, accepting the approval, then held up his hand for quiet. "There's one more thing I need to address," he said, his voice turning cold. "Mrs. Reed's behavior tonight has been unconscionable. I witnessed her initial approach to Deja. I heard her insults, her implications, her systematic attempt to humiliate someone whose only crime was existing in a space Mrs. Reed deemed her exclusive territory." The applause died away, replaced by uncomfortable silence from Charlotte's former supporters. "And then I watched her commit assault," Dr. Chen said flatly, "in front of hundreds of witnesses. There is no excuse for that, no amount of champagne, no degree of wounded pride, nothing that justifies putting your hands on another person in violence." He looked around the room, his gaze stern. "I am deeply disappointed in every person here who laughed at Mrs. Reed's cruelty, who encouraged her harassment, who stood by and did nothing while she systematically attacked a woman who has done nothing but good in this world." Several people had the grace to look ashamed. Phones were being quietly put away, as if people were hoping their recordings would be forgotten. "This is the problem with our world," Dr. Chen said, his voice ringing with conviction. "We have confused wealth with worth. We have mistaken designer labels for character. We have created a system where people like Mrs. Reed believe they can treat others as disposable because of accidents of birth and marriage. Well, I am here to tell you, it stops now. It stops tonight, in this room." The applause returned, even louder than before. Alexander released Deja's hand and stepped forward, his expression transformed. The cold fury was gone, replaced by something fierce and proud. "Dr. Chen is right," Alexander said, his voice carrying through the ballroom, "about all of it, but especially about Deja." He turned to face her, and the love in his eyes was unmistakable. "I have spent my entire adult life building a company, making money, accumulating power," Alexander said. "And I was good at it. Maybe too good, because somewhere along the way, I forgot what any of it was for." He took Deja's hands in his, addressing her directly now, though his words were for everyone. "And then I met you, and you reminded me that success isn't measured in dollars or market share. It's measured in lives changed. in children learning to read, in communities being served, in showing up day after day for people who need you. You made me a better man, Alexander continued, his voice thick with emotion. Not because you tried to change me, but because you showed me, by example, what it means to live a life of purpose and meaning. He pulled her closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. So when Charlotte Reed or anyone else questions why we're together, here's the answer. I'm with you because you're the best person I know. Because you challenge me. Because you see me, not my bank account, or my company, or my influence, but me, the man who shows up to read to kids because his wife taught him that's what matters. The ballroom erupted again, but Alexander wasn't finished. He turned to face the crowd, his arm around Deja's waist, pulling her against his side. My wife doesn't need me to defend her, he said, his voice strong and clear. She's more than capable of defending herself. But I'll be damned if I let anyone in this room leave here thinking there's any validity to the poison Charlotte Reed spread tonight. Deja is not a gold digger. She's not an opportunist. She's not calculating or manipulative or any of the other vile things that were said about her. His voice rose with each sentence. She is brilliant, compassionate, dedicated, and real. And if anyone has a problem with that, if anyone wants to question my judgment or her character, you can take it up with me. Personally. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and given Alexander Styles's power in this city, everyone understood exactly what that meant. The applause was deafening now, accompanied by cheers and shouts of support. But then, cutting through the celebration, came a commotion from the entrance. The massive ballroom doors burst open and a group of people rushed in. Charlotte's family. Marcus Reed was in the lead, his face ashen, his expensive tuxedo disheveled. Behind him came Charlotte's parents, William and Patricia Wentworth, old money aristocrats who looked like they'd aged 10 years in the last hour. Charlotte's brother followed, along with what appeared to be several family attorneys. They all looked terrified. The ballroom fell silent again, sensing a new act in the drama. Marcus's eyes scanned the room frantically until they landed on Alexander. He pushed through the crowd, his expression desperate. "Alexander," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "Alexander, please, we need to talk. Privately. Now." Behind him, William Wentworth looked around the ballroom, taking in the scene. The guests staring, the phones recording, the palpable hostility in the air. His face crumbled. "What has she done?" Patricia Wentworth whispered, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Oh God, what has she done to us?" And in that moment, watching Charlotte's family arrive in panicked desperation, everyone in the room understood. Charlotte hadn't just destroyed herself tonight. She'd put her entire family's empire in jeopardy. The Reed family's entrance had transformed the ballroom's atmosphere from triumphant celebration to something darker, more primal. The crowd sensed blood in the water, and they waited with bated breath to see what would happen next. Marcus Reed reached Alexander first, his hand outstretched, his face contorted with desperation. "Alexander, please," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be, but please, let's talk about this privately, man to man, business to business." Alexander's expression was carved from ice. "I have nothing to say to you privately. Please." Marcus's voice rose to something close to a whimper. "You don't understand what's happening. The videos, they're everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Our phones have been ringing non-stop. Investors, board members, partners, everyone is calling." "That's not my problem," Alexander said coldly. "But it could be solved." Marcus was nearly shouting now, panic overwhelming whatever dignity he had left. We can fix this. We can make a statement. Issue an apology. Donate to your wife's charities, whatever you want. Just, please, whatever I want? Alexander's voice was quiet, lethal. I want your wife to not have assaulted mine. But we can't undo that, can we? William Wentworth pushed past his son-in-law, his weathered face pale and drawn. At 70, he had the bearing of old money aristocracy, tall, silver-haired, accustomed to being obeyed. But now his hands trembled as he approached. "Mr. Styles," William said, his voice formal but strained. "I apologize for my daughter's behavior. It was inexcusable, absolutely inexcusable. But I'm begging you, as one businessman to another, don't let this destroy everything we've built." "You should have thought of that before you raised a daughter who thinks assault is acceptable," Alexander replied. "We didn't raise her to be like this," Patricia Wentworth interjected, tears streaming down her heavily made-up face. "I don't know what happened. The drinking, the stress." "Stop making excuses for her," Deja said suddenly, her voice cutting through Patricia's justifications. Everyone turned to look at her. "Your daughter is a grown woman who made a choice. Stop infantilizing her." Patricia's mouth opened and closed, shocked at being addressed so directly. Marcus turned his attention to Deja now, dropping to his knees in the middle of the ballroom. Gasps rippled through the crowd at the spectacle. Marcus Reed, heir to a billion-dollar real estate empire, kneeling on marble floors in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. "Mrs. Styles," Marcus said, his voice breaking, "I am so sorry for what my wife did to you. Please, I'm begging you. We have 3 children. 3 kids who don't deserve to have their lives destroyed because their mother made a terrible mistake." "Get up," Deja said quietly. "You're embarrassing yourself." "I don't care." Marcus's voice echoed through the ballroom. "Do you know what's happening right now? Do you understand what your husband can do to us with a single phone call?" "Enlighten me," Deja said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Marcus's face crumpled. "Reed Properties has 3 major developments in progress, all of them financed through a consortium of investors that Styles Technologies has connections to. If Alexander makes one call, just one, our funding disappears. Our projects die. We lose everything." William Wentworth stepped forward, his aristocratic composure cracking. "The Wentworth Foundation has partnerships with a dozen tech companies, all of them either directly connected to Styles Technologies or dependent on relationships in that ecosystem. If word gets out that we are persona non grata, your social capital evaporates," Alexander finished coldly. "Your board positions disappear. Your club memberships get quietly revoked. Your children get uninvited from the right schools, the right parties, the right opportunities. You become untouchable, but not in the way you used to be." The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in the ballroom understood the reality of power in their world. Wealth could be built or destroyed with whispered words in the right ears. Reputations could be shattered with a single viral video. And Alexander Styles held more power than almost anyone in that room. "Yes," William said quietly, his shoulders sagging. "Exactly that." Charlotte's brother, Jonathan Wentworth, a man in his 30s who had been silent until now, stepped forward. His face was red, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Charlotte?" Jonathan shouted toward the doorway where Charlotte had been removed. Then he turned to Alexander. "My sister she's always been difficult, entitled. But this is beyond anything. Don't Patricia cut him off sharply. "Don't you dare turn on your sister right now." "Why not?" Jonathan rounded on his mother. "She turned on all of us. My business that I built myself, is already getting cancellation calls because I'm related to her. Because her face is all over the internet, hitting a woman at a charity gala." He turned back to Alexander and Deja, desperation written across his features. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. I've barely spoken to Charlotte in years because she's... Well, you've seen what she is. But now I'm being punished for sharing her DNA." "That's how these things work," Alexander said without sympathy. "You benefit from family connections on the way up. You suffer from them on the way down." More attorneys had entered the ballroom now, huddling with the Wentworth-Reed contingent, whispering urgently. One of them, a severe-looking woman in her 50s, approached Alexander directly. "Mr. Styles, I'm Rebecca Goldman, representing the Reed and Wentworth families. Perhaps we could discuss settlement terms." "There's nothing to settle," Alexander said flatly. "This isn't a business negotiation." "Everything is a negotiation," Rebecca replied, her lawyer instincts taking over. "We're prepared to offer substantial compensation. You think you can pay me off?" Alexander's voice dropped to something dangerous. "You think there's a dollar amount that makes this acceptable?" Rebecca realized her mistake too late. "No, of course not. I simply meant—" "Get out of my sight," Alexander said coldly. The ballroom's attention shifted again as the doors opened once more, and Charlotte herself was escorted back in by security. Her white gown was stained and wrinkled, her makeup completely destroyed by tears, her hair falling from its elaborate updo. When she saw her entire family assembled in the ballroom, all of them looking at her with expressions ranging from anger to desperation to fear, she seemed to shrink into herself. "Mommy?" Charlotte whispered, looking at Patricia like a child caught in an unforgivable act. But Patricia just shook her head, unable to speak through her tears. Marcus stood up from his kneeling position and crossed to his wife in 3 long strides. For a moment, Deja thought he might comfort her. Instead, he grabbed her arm roughly. "Do you understand what you've done?" Marcus hissed, his voice low but carrying through the silent ballroom. "Do you have any comprehension of what you've destroyed?" "I'm sorry," Charlotte whimpered. "I was drunk and angry, and—" "Our children," Marcus's voice broke. "Our children are getting death threats on social media. Death threats. Because their mother became a viral video villain. Because you couldn't control yourself for one evening." Charlotte's legs seemed to give out. She would have fallen if Marcus hadn't been holding her arm. Security guards helped lower her into a chair that someone had brought over. The mighty Charlotte Reed, who had held court in this very ballroom just hours ago, was now a broken, sobbing mess in front of everyone she'd ever tried to impress. William Wentworth approached his daughter, his face a mask of disappointment. "Charlotte, you need to apologize, properly, right now." "I did apologize," Charlotte sobbed. "I tried." "You tried to manipulate the situation," William said harshly. "You gave them theater. Now give them truth." Charlotte looked up at her father through swollen eyes, then across the ballroom to where Deja and Alexander stood. The distance between them might as well have been miles. Slowly, painfully, Charlotte stood. Marcus kept a hand on her elbow. Whether to support her or prevent her from fleeing, no one could tell. She walked across the ballroom floor, her heels clicking against marble in the devastating silence. With each step, she seemed to age, the mask of youth and beauty crumbling to reveal something raw and broken underneath. When she reached Deja, Charlotte fell to her knees. The gasps from the crowd were audible. Charlotte Reed, society queen, arbiter of taste, woman who had spent her entire adult life looking down on others, was on her knees before the woman she had assaulted. "I'm sorry," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." "Louder!" William commanded from across the room. "Everyone needs to hear this." Charlotte's voice rose, shaking but clear. "I'm sorry. I was cruel. I was violent. I was everything ugly and wrong, and I have no excuse, no justification. Just please." Her voice broke entirely on the last word. "Please don't destroy my family, my children. They don't deserve to suffer for my mistakes." The ballroom watched in stunned silence as the Reed and Wentworth families, one of New York's most powerful dynasties, were reduced to begging in public. Marcus joined his wife on his knees. Then, after a moment of hesitation, so did William and Patricia. Jonathan remained standing, but bowed his head. The attorneys hovered nearby, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to leave. 500 people watched as an empire humbled itself. Phones were recording every second. This would be the story people told for years. The night Charlotte Reed destroyed herself and brought her entire family down with her. Deja looked down at Charlotte, at her ruined makeup and designer gown, at the woman who had tried so hard to destroy her just an hour ago. She felt Alexander's presence beside her, steady and strong, but she knew this decision was hers to make. The ballroom waited. What would Deja do? Accept the apology and let them slink away? Reject it and watch Alexander destroy them? Something else entirely? Deja took a slow breath, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on her. The red mark on her cheek still burned. Her heart still ached from Charlotte's cruel words. Her hands still trembled from the adrenaline and emotion of the evening. But as she looked at the broken woman kneeling before her, she didn't feel triumph or satisfaction. She felt tired and clear and certain about what came next. "Stand up," Deja said quietly. Charlotte hesitated, then slowly rose to her feet, followed by her family. They stood before Deja and Alexander like defendants awaiting a verdict. Deja stepped forward, away from Alexander's protective presence, standing on her own. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured, and carried to every corner of the ballroom. "I don't know if your apology is real," Deja began. "I don't know if you're sorry for what you did or just sorry about the consequences. And honestly, I don't know if I care about the difference anymore." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "What I do know is this. Forgiveness isn't a word you say. It's not a performance you give. It's an action. It's a change in behavior sustained over time." Charlotte nodded frantically, hope flickering in her swollen eyes. "So here are my terms," Deja continued, her voice growing stronger. "Not for forgiveness. You haven't earned that yet. But for mercy. For the chance to begin earning it." The ballroom leaned in, everyone straining to hear. Deja looked directly at Charlotte, her dark eyes blazing with determination. "You wanted to know what I want? I'll tell you exactly what I want." Deja stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by 500 people, and felt more herself than she had all evening. The crimson gown that Charlotte had mocked, the simple pearls Alexander had given her, the face that bore a red handprint from violence. All of it was her, authentic, unadorned, unbroken. "Here's what I want," Deja said, her voice carrying with crystal clarity. "I want you to spend the next year, not 6 months, a full year, working in the communities you've spent your life looking down on. Charlotte's face flickered with something, hope mixed with trepidation. Not a photo op, Deja continued. Not a check-writing exercise. Real work. The kind that gets your hands dirty and your heart uncomfortable. You'll volunteer at the Harlem Community Center where Alexander and I met. 40 hours a month, minimum. Tutoring, mentoring, serving meals, cleaning facilities, whatever they need. I will, Charlotte said quickly. I'll do it. I promise. I'm not finished, Deja said, her tone sharp enough to silence Charlotte immediately. Your entire family participates. Your husband, your parents, your brother, your children, if they're old enough. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but William placed a hand on his arm, shaking his head. Don't. You'll work with people who have real problems, Deja continued. Single mothers working 3 jobs, kids who go to bed hungry, families facing eviction. And you'll listen to them. Actually listen. Not to feel better about yourselves, but to understand that their struggles are real, their dignity is intact, and their worth has nothing to do with their bank accounts. Patricia Wentworth was crying again, but silently now, her hand pressed to her mouth. Every month, you'll write a reflection, Deja said, about what you learned, what challenged you, what changed in your perspective, and you'll submit it to Dr. Chen, who will monitor your progress. Dr. Marcus Chen, still standing near the front, nodded solemnly. I accept that responsibility. If you miss a session without legitimate cause, you start over, Deja continued, her voice unwavering. If you show up with the wrong attitude, you start over. If you treat this like a punishment you're enduring rather than an opportunity for growth, you start over. The terms were harsh, demanding, nearly impossible for people who had never had to answer to anyone. And at the end of that year, Deja said, her eyes locked on Charlotte's, you'll stand in front of the community you've served, not in a ballroom full of your peers, but in a room full of the people you helped, and they will decide if you've changed. They will decide if your apology meant anything. They will decide if you've earned forgiveness. And if they say no, Charlotte whispered, her voice small. Then you don't get it, Deja said simply. Forgiveness isn't owed to you. It's a gift that has to be earned. And the people you've spent your life dismissing get to decide if you've done the work. The ballroom was silent, processing the verdict. Deja turned to Alexander, her voice softening slightly but remaining firm. As for financial or social consequences, that's your decision. But I'm asking you, for me, to give them this chance. Let their actions speak. If they fail, if they quit, if they prove this was all performance, then do what you need to do. Alexander studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. If that's what you want. It is, Deja confirmed. She turned back to the Reed and Wentworth families. This is mercy, not forgiveness. Mercy. The opportunity to prove you're capable of growth. Don't waste it. For a moment, no one moved. Then Charlotte, still on unsteady legs, nodded. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for giving us a chance we don't deserve. You're right, Deja said bluntly. You don't deserve it. The children you'll be serving deserve it. They deserve to see that even the most privileged, entitled people can change. That's why I'm doing this. Not for you, but for them. The distinction landed like a hammer blow. This wasn't about redemption for Charlotte. It was about hope for the communities she would serve. William Wentworth stepped forward, his aristocratic bearing somehow intact despite everything. Mrs. Styles, you have my word. Our family will fulfill every requirement you've set forth. Your word means nothing to me yet, Deja said, not unkindly but truthfully. Show me through actions. Then we'll talk about words. William nodded, accepting the rebuke with surprising grace. Marcus helped Charlotte to her feet, his hand gentle now rather than angry. He looked at Deja with something that might have been respect. We'll be there. First session. I'll contact the community center tomorrow. Dr. Chen will handle coordination, Deja said. He has my authorization to verify your participation and evaluate your commitment. Understood, Marcus said quietly. The Reed and Wentworth families began to withdraw, moving toward the ballroom exit. But they weren't rushing now. There was a heaviness to their steps, a weight of obligation and shame that would follow them for a long time. As they reached the doorway, Charlotte turned back one last time. Her eyes found Deja's across the crowded ballroom. I was wrong about you, Charlotte said, her voice barely carrying. About everything. Deja didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Charlotte would either prove her words true through action, or she wouldn't. Time would tell. The family disappeared through the doors, and the moment they were gone, the ballroom erupted. But it wasn't applause for spectacle or drama. It was something deeper, a recognition of moral clarity in action, of justice tempered with mercy, of power used not for destruction, but for transformation. People rose to their feet, applauding not the billionaire who could have crushed his enemies, but the woman who had chosen a harder, more meaningful path. Deja! 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 The chant started somewhere in the back and spread through the room like wildfire. Dr. Chen was the first to approach, his weathered face filled with pride. That was extraordinary. Truly extraordinary. I would be honored to oversee their service. Thank you, Deja said, her voice thick with emotion. I couldn't think of anyone better. Helen from Table 1 pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. You are remarkable. What you just did, the grace, the wisdom, the strength. I've never seen anything like it. Victoria, who had been so condescending earlier, approached with obvious shame on her face. Mrs. Styles, I owe you an apology. I was part of the problem tonight. And I'm sorry. Deja looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Then be part of the solution. The community center always needs volunteers. Victoria's eyes widened. Yes, I'll do that. More people crowded around, wanting to shake Deja's hand, express their admiration, ask about her literacy programs. The woman they had dismissed hours ago as insignificant was now the moral center of the room. Through it all, Alexander stood slightly apart, watching his wife handle the attention with the same grace and authenticity she brought to everything. When their eyes met across the crowd, the love and pride in his expression made Deja's heart swell. Finally, the crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming, the evening slowly finding its rhythm again, though everyone knew nothing would be quite the same after tonight. Alexander took Deja's hand and led her away from the ballroom floor, out through a side door and onto a private balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air was a relief after the stifling intensity inside. For a long moment, they just stood there, his arms around her waist, her head resting against his chest, looking out at the glittering Manhattan skyline. You were incredible in there, Alexander said softly, his lips close to her ear. I was terrified, Deja admitted. Every moment, every word. I kept thinking about what Charlotte said, that I was a gold digger, an imposter. that I didn't belong. And now? Alexander asked gently. Deja was quiet for a moment, letting the question settle. Then she pulled back slightly to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the city lights. Now I know that belonging isn't about fitting into someone else's definition of worth. It's about knowing your own value and refusing to shrink to make others comfortable. She looked back at the city, at the millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one struggling, striving, surviving. I belong everywhere I choose to be, Deja continued, her voice growing stronger. Not because of your name or your money or your influence, but because I know who I am. I know what I value. I know what I contribute to the world. And that's exactly why I fell in love with you, Alexander said, turning her to face him fully. Because you've never needed me to validate you. You've never asked me to make you feel worthy. You were whole and complete before we met, and you remain whole and complete now. He cupped her face gently in his hands, careful of her bruised cheek. You didn't need me to defend you tonight, he continued. You could have handled Charlotte entirely on your own. But I'm grateful I got to stand beside you, to witness your strength, to be reminded of why I'm the lucky one in this marriage. We're both lucky, Deja said, smiling through tears she hadn't realized were falling. Because we see each other, really see each other, not the money or the status or the image, just the people we actually are. Alexander kissed her then, soft and tender, a reaffirmation of everything they'd been through and everything they would face together. When they broke apart, Deja looked back at the ballroom through the glass doors. She could see people talking, laughing, the evening continuing, but it was different now. She was different now. Do you want to go back in? Alexander asked. Or should we leave? Deja considered for a moment, then smiled, a real smile, full and genuine. Let's go back. I have a literacy program to promote, and there are at least 50 potential donors in there who just watched me handle the worst night of my life with grace. Alexander laughed, the sound rich and warm. That's my wife, never missing an opportunity to advocate for her kids. Never, Deja agreed. That's who I am. That's who I'll always be. They walked back into the ballroom together, hand in hand, and the evening continued around them. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in how others saw Deja, but in how she saw herself. Across the city, in the Reed family's penthouse, Charlotte sat in her bedroom, still in her stained white gown, scrolling through her phone with numb fingers. The videos were everywhere. Millions of views, thousands of comments, most of them viciously condemning her actions. Her name was trending, not for fashion or parties or social status, but for violence and cruelty. Everything she had built, her reputation, her social standing, her carefully curated image, was destroyed. Her phone buzzed with another call from her publicist. She ignored it. There was nothing to spin, no way to make this better with a press release or a carefully worded apology. Marcus entered the bedroom, his face drawn. The kids are finally asleep. I had to take away their phones. The things people are saying. I know, Charlotte whispered. Do you? Marcus asked, not unkindly. Do you understand what you've done? Not just to yourself, but to all of us? Charlotte looked up at him, mascara-stained tears still on her face. I don't know who I am anymore. Marcus sat beside her on the bed, the distance between them both physical and emotional. Maybe this is your chance to find out. To become someone real instead of someone performed. I don't know how, Charlotte admitted, her voice breaking. "Then you'll learn," Marcus said firmly. "Starting tomorrow, we'll contact Dr. Chen. We'll show up. We'll do the work. Because that woman, Deja Styles, she gave us a gift tonight. And if we waste it, we deserve everything that comes after." Charlotte nodded slowly, looking at her reflection in the darkened window. The glamorous, powerful, untouchable Charlotte Reed was gone. In her place was someone she didn't recognize. Someone frightened and small and uncertain. But maybe, just maybe, someone who could still become something better. The Metropolitan Charity Gala continued into the early morning hours, but the energy had transformed. What should have been a scandal that destroyed the evening had instead become a lesson that elevated it. Donations to Deja's literacy programs poured in. Business cards were exchanged. Volunteers signed up. And at the center of it all was Deja Styles, not hiding in her husband's shadow, but standing in her own light. A woman who had faced cruelty and violence and emerged not broken, but stronger. Not bitter, but wiser. Not vengeful, but just. When they finally left the gala at 2 a.m, Deja's feet aching from her heels and her voice hoarse from conversation, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Complete and absolute certainty about who she was and where she belonged. Not because anyone had given her permission, but because she had claimed it for herself. 1 year later, Dr. Marcus Chen sat in the Harlem Community Center, surrounded by parents, children, and volunteers. At the front of the room stood Charlotte Reed, her designer clothes replaced by jeans and a simple sweater, her perfectly styled hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had shown up every week for 12 months. Her family had too. Marcus volunteering in after-school programs, William helping with financial literacy classes, Patricia organizing food drives. Even Jonathan had found his way to meaningful contribution. They had been humbled, challenged, changed. Now, the community they had served would vote on whether they had earned forgiveness. Deja sat in the back row, Alexander beside her, watching as Charlotte stood before the people she had once dismissed as beneath her. "I can't undo what I did," Charlotte said to the assembled group. "I can't take back the person I was. But I can show you the person I'm becoming, and I can promise that I will never stop trying to be worthy of the grace you've shown me." The room was silent. Then, slowly, one person began to clap. Then another. And another. It wasn't thunderous applause. It wasn't forgiveness freely given. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, Deja thought, watching Charlotte's eyes fill with grateful tears, that's all any of us can ask for. A chance to begin again, to be better, to earn our way back to grace.